Salutations and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Kodology and I make videos about everything and anything to do with modern society. So without further ado, let's get into this video because it is an interesting one. I was inspired to make this video because I listened to a podcast for the first time in forever, I would say, about Dixie D'Amelio. Basically, YouTubers Tara McNee and Madison Brown were talking about music and influences going into the music world and genre once they realized that they've got all this fame from doing little TikTok dances. Now what do they do with it? So long story short, it seems that people are in agreement that Dixie can't sing, and I'm neither here nor there about it, and I wasn't when I was watching the podcast. So I obviously, like anybody who had never listened to Dixie D'Amelio and didn't even know that she was a singer, I went onto Spotify and I found her new song and I listened to it, and I was obviously, like I'm sure anybody who's like heard somebody say that somebody's music is terrible, I expected it to be terrible. And I did not go in with much hope. I thought I would have a little chuckle, but I was oddly surprised because I actually really liked the song. I think what I liked about the song and what was quite odd was that it reminded me of something. I couldn't really establish what it was while I was listening to it, so I had to listen to it about 56 more times according to my Spotify history. So I closed my eyes and immediately it came to me. It was the image of Lindsay Lohan in Confessions of voice, making songs with a catchy, grungy riff that somehow makes you think about boys, girls, an aesthetic high school experience. You know, I'll happily listen to a Lindsay song. Like, that song in Confession of a Teenage Drama Queen is just capital, bravo. Here. And it made me so nostalgic that I watched the film again. I mean, it was fascinating to see what Jennifer was before high school went downhill. I will admit it, I loved Dixie's new song. What it really brought to mind for me was this nostalgia, because it was very nostalgic in terms of its riff, in terms of like, it's very, very catchy and very, very specific. And it has that same aura about it as so many songs that back in the early 2000s were incredibly popular, even though the people singing those songs were clearly not singers, if that makes sense. What's interesting about them, about these people who weren't singers, such as Lindsay Lohan, Paris Hilton, Jessica Simpson, Hilary Duff. I know this is bad, I know people do think that they singers, but like, I think that they started in acting before they sort of did the singing thing, and that it sort of just like, you know, blew up. But you know, they have really good songs. And that's the important thing, and their voices are good enough. Something that's very characteristic about this is the aesthetic which they embodied. And so that's what I would like to talk about. What we are seeing at the moment in popular culture, particularly on TikTok, which I re-downloaded purely for this video. It is now deleted, don't worry, I can't do it for longer than 2 hours. But alas, I think that this is an example of people who are not necessarily conventionally good singers or good actors starring in films which have a very early 2000s vibe and atmosphere to them, and influencers going into the music industry and singing songs that are very simple, clean cut, but have a catchy riff and sort of make them sound okay enough. I think that this has to do with just trend culture in general. So according to Merriam-Webster, a trend can be defined as a general direction of change, a way of behaving, proceeding, etc., that is developed and becoming more common. It is something that is currently popular or fashionable. However, I would come up with my own little gobbet to attach to that definition of trends, because I think that trends are very important in this day and age. So according to my added little definition of a trend, I think that a trend can be defined as the accessible short-term resolution to a inaccessible societal dilemma or problem. Let me explain through an example. A major problem that we have in the modern age is housing. Affordable housing, being able to own your own house, being able to be self-sufficient in the ways that our parents and grandparents were. There is so much uncertainty around whether any of us will be able to actually afford to live in our own home and space with full security and a sense of family, you know, in that sense. And so what is the immediate solution to that? Oh, let's find a home that we can afford, such as a tiny house or a 3D printed house, or we can invest in van life and van culture, and that can be how we live. And it doesn't even have to be something as big or as life transforming as investing in a tiny home or selling up everything and getting in a van. It can be something as simple as fashion or clothing, or just like a general like aesthetic that you decorate your room. For instance, dark or light academia. I think, for instance, dark and light academia trends were enticing, and they are enticing, because they enabled everyday folks access into a seemingly inaccessible world. And the same can be said with the recent rise of the old money aesthetic. Hello, editing me here once again. I just want to add a bit more context and detail to the overlaying clips that I've put of a YouTuber called Ruby Granger. She's sort of the poster child of dark academia, at least on YouTube, insofar as it really is an aesthetic that she embodies quite seriously. And she's lovely and it's great, and like, go off, sister. But I do think that, for instance, she really represents an example of somebody who uses the aesthetic in order to compensate for the fact that a few years ago she applied to Oxford, and it had been a dream of hers since she was a child to go to Oxford. Long story short, she unfortunately didn't get in, and that has been something that's featured on her channel in a very moving and captivating way. So what I wanted to say about the nostalgia aspect, but also the aspect of using an aesthetic in order to gain access into a world or into an institution which you otherwise cannot or haven't. The interesting thing about social media, particularly in this and, well, our digital age, is that anybody who has a phone, anybody who has access to the internet can access this aesthetic, can access copies of the originals. Kids who live in minimum wage households can access the world of the rich and inaccessible of New York's elite via Gossip Girl and Gossip Girl reboots. And they can adopt even the fashion trends of these individuals. For instance, this signet ring. I know signet rings have suddenly become quite, well, not quite suddenly, but like, you know, gradually people are very into the signet ring. And I think it is definitely a part of this old money aesthetic that people are getting into, myself included, insofar as the signet ring is concerned. This ring cost 30 cents or 30p in the UK. Does it matter? Of course not. It does the job. It looks regal. My finger and hand look banging. That's the only thing that matters. So in a way, it's provided a short-term solution to a bigger problem of, say, income inequality and class inequality. And this really became of interest to me after I read a Business Insider article which spoke about how Gen Z is igniting this quote-unquote throwback economy. And this article very interestingly highlighted the paradox in this. How TikTok, which is the epitome of our social media age, the epitome of this gig economy, is somehow the platform and the place in which these young people are all coming together in order to yearn for and connect with each other over a pre-social media way of life, aesthetic and culture. It seems weird, it seems to not make sense at face value, but I do think that it actually makes a lot of sense. On TikTok and on YouTube, there are videos and influencers just flooding these platforms with videos about thrifting. The number of Depop accounts which I see linked to influencer bios is really resonant, and it's quite a good example of this, as well as the trends for bucket hats, very bright colored dresses, very preppy clothing. The clothing within Reboots is also very telling of this. Headbands, scrunchies, chunky shoes, and wireless headphones are also making quite a comeback. And I did notice this with my wireless headphones on, listening to some banging tracks from Clara Schumann. It's kind of this nostalgia for like simpler times, and I think that word simple is very key to this rise in an interest in our cultural phenomena of today. I think Netflix is pivotal to how new shows are really feeding into this and have really picked up on this being the foundational trend of Gen Z, their primary audience, at least in futuristic terms, definitely their primary audience. And Gen Z is very different to other generations in that we are far more focused on moralistic issues, on being very conscious about societal and bigger problems. But the crux of the issue is that we do not have the financial, the social, the any kind of clout and power to actually do anything about it. And the vast majority of Gen Z are, relatively speaking, to the lifestyle of influencers online whom they see and idolize, poor. And right now, people are starting to question the conventional routes to success. I think we can all agree that we're not really invested in meritocracy, we're not really invested in the American or neoliberal capitalist dream. And what is interesting to look at with shows now is that there is a revival of old shows which never really, you wouldn't think would appeal to a younger audience. But Gen Z and young millennials are apparently binge watching the likes of Friends, How I Met Your Mother, and The Nanny. And I think that this says a lot and is very interesting to see because of what these shows represent. And I would like to include in this a reference to another show, a very recent show on Netflix that came out a few days ago called Pretty Smart. It is an example of Netflix really feeding into this nostalgia of today's teens and young adults. Like Friends and The Nanny, which are, I won't go into them, but they are sort of focused on very key elements. Pretty Smart has these same elements. It has the same vibe, the same characters, the same commentary that it is making. There's a very clean aesthetic to all these shows, and what I mean by this is that, like a lot of the early 2000s films such as Confessions of a Teenage Drama Queen, I would say Legally Blonde, all the chick flicks, rom-coms of that age have this very noticeable thing and characteristic of them, and that is simple problems. Simple problems I would define as life dilemmas and issues which are, relatively speaking, simple insofar as resolutions can be found. And what all these shows have in common is that in every episode there is a problem that arises, that it has to be resolved, and that after 20 minutes it is resolved. What is also very characteristic about these shows is that it's very easy to follow along with the plot line. It's very easy to see the different quirks and characteristics of all the characters, and Pretty Smart does this very well. The show stars Emily Osment as the protagonist, Chelsea, who is a very smart recent Harvard graduate who moves in into her sister's shared house in Los Angeles. Her sister is the complete antithesis of her, living her best life in LA. And so Chelsea moves in with her sister Claire. There is the spiritual yogi who has quit her corporate law firm job in order to pursue a more spiritual and meaningful life. There is the gay influencer who cares about his looks and about his followers and following. There is the fitness instructor or the fitness trainer who is handsome, good looking. He makes some good insights about how, we need to care about the present. Like, life is great. You just need to put on a smile, be happy, and you'll get through it, dude. And so these characters are quite distinct, but you really don't need to invest much in them. And you can see the same sort of characters in like Friends, in How I Met Your Mother, in The Nanny, very universal characters. And why I call this show nostalgic is because of how I consumed it. I watched it in less than a day, and I didn't actually even really watch it. I was not invested in the characters or anything, but I know everything that happened. And that's because whilst I was watching it, I was just getting on with other things. I can follow what's going on without being invested. And lots of shows on Netflix recently have that attribute to them. And this is something which I read about in The New Yorker a while ago in a very interesting article about Emily in Paris and the rise of ambient television. This article was written by a writer who writes largely about minimalism called Kyle Chaika, and it is a very interesting article. I'd highly recommend it, and we'll link it below. And in this New Yorker article, he writes the following about Emily in Paris. In this and other recent programming, Netflix is pioneering a genre that I've come to think of as ambient television. It's as ignorable as it is interesting, as the musician Brian Eno wrote when he coined the term ambient music in the liner notes to his 1978 album Ambient One: Music for Airports, a wash of slow melodic synth compositions. Ambient denotes something that you don't have to pay attention to in order to enjoy, but which is still seductive enough to be compelling if you choose to do so momentarily. Like gentle new age soundscapes, Emily in Paris is soothing. It is slow and relatively monotonous, the dramatic moments too predetermined to really be dramatic. Nothing bad ever happens to our heroine for long. The early era of prestige television was predicated on shows with meta-narratives to be puzzled out, and which merited deep analyses read the day after watching. Here, there is nothing to figure out. As prestige passes its peak, we're moving into the ambient era, which succumbs to rather than competes with your phone. All the characters on the show are on their phones. Therefore, why shouldn't I be on my phone? Chelsea is reading a book for half of the show. Therefore, why shouldn't I read my book? And I think that this is firstly quite like a modern thing, but I also think that nostalgia touches in a very specific way, in that it's very simple watching, and that relates to and equates to the sort of simplicity which nostalgia has attached to it, and that notion of a simple, less complicated, less uncertain life in which we have to contend with now. I mean, in Pretty Smart, Chelsea doesn't really know what to do after her boyfriend's broken up with her, which is why she ends up living with her sister, and she gets a job at a gym, and she literally spends the entirety of her shift reading Dickens. What job would you get where you are at the front desk and you get to read Dickens for your whole shift? Or in one episode, she tries online dating, and her entire shift, she's texting a guy. We know the reality of being a waitress is no easy walk in the park, but Claire just ups and leaves her job in order to help her best friend find the love of his life. And her boss is okay with it. She gives all of her tables the wrong meals, yet somehow she makes enough money to live in a very large, nice house in LA. It's just, it doesn't make any sense, but I mean, it doesn't have to. Their lives are simple, their problems simple, they all are very good looking, life's easy. And that is what all ambient television, whether it be of the 90s or the early 2000s, or even insofar as Netflix is concerned now has to be. And that is the thing with the likes of modern trends. For instance, thrifting, like for instance, the tiny house movement, old money aesthetics. They offer simple solutions, simple, digestible solutions or resolutions to greater issues. The old money aesthetic is very big among Gen Z at the moment. It seems to be what is replacing dark and light academia to an extent, even though they sort of are on par in a way. I think we can see this with, particularly, I would say, as always, with every trend that happens. Lana Del Rey spearheaded this, and I think it's very recent. This relates to Lana Del Rey post Norman fucking Rockwell. The music video to Chemtrails Over the Country Club is very telling of where Lana is in her life, or at least in the life of her persona as Lana Del Rey. LA, blue skies, this very Kennedy family-esque ambiance and vibe to it, and also the featuring of Lana Del Rey's infamous face mask. Why would she wear a completely see-through diamond mask? And I think it's because, well, it's yearning for a time when we didn't have to wear masks, or when there wasn't that uncertainty in which we weren't living through a which has completely shattered any sense of stability, of simplicity, of knowing for certain the future. And this definitely runs into the rise of the old money prep aesthetic, which is very telling from the reboot of Gossip Girl. I think what is also noticeable is that obviously the cast is far more ethnically diverse and far more diverse in terms of its portrayal of sexuality. And this again feeds into the notion that old money aesthetic is accessible. It's accessible to anyone and everyone, which just for me rings bells of trends being a simple solution to a far bigger, inaccessible, complex problem or societal dilemma, or something that is very topical, such as class inequality, racial inequality, sexual inequality, what have you. One brand that does make a noticeable appearance in the Gossip Girl reboot in terms of style, as far as I could see on Instagram and Twitter and Tumblr, was Balenciaga. The Simpsons were the major selling point and branding and appeal of Balenciaga at the recent Paris Fashion Week, and this definitely feeds into my little theory here. However, I feel that even though it is a major brand and label, it is seemingly becoming more accessible, or at least presenting itself as such, if not in the price, at least insofar as it feeds into nostalgia.
Hello, apologies, editing me here once again. What I really wanted to emphasize about Balenciaga was that their Spring-Summer 2020 show digresses greatly from its previous season and clothing, particularly in that, and I quote, "The brand's most recent physical runway prior to the big Rona in autumn and winter 2020 explored themes related to climate change and featured an apocalyptic flooded venue." And this is all very morbid, all very much associated with the issues of our times, those very, very big issues. And Balenciaga's fall 2021 campaign followed in the same footsteps as its previous ones, very AI, futuristic, apocalyptic, quite morbid, actually, very, very morbid. On Balenciaga's official YouTube channel, you can see that the Simpsons video of their Spring-Summer 2022 show has over 3 million views, contrary to the views which it got for its previous shows and previous campaigns. this one has really gone off. And notably in falling into a concern with nostalgia and bringing up nostalgia, and it was quite exceptional and definitely represented something quite atypical but very, very nostalgic and optimistic. Again, I think on a more pessimistic note, representing trying to find a easy solution or an easy selling resolution rather than going for the very futuristic, very big problem ambiance of the fashion show, which they went for in 2020, and it has worked.
So yes, this trend is a bit bittersweet to me, but I think nostalgia is here to stay until somehow the real big, long-term, seemingly inaccessible and seemingly impossible to solve issues of our age are reckoned with. And I think trends are just a good distraction, similarly to ambient television. But I would love to know what you think. I know what I think. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to do anything about it. I mean, man, I've got the Golden Girls to watch. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please like or dislike, comment, subscribe if you are not. And yes, I'll see you in the next one.